preached here. I haven't been not only just preached, but I haven't been to Oak Ridge in quite a while. So it's nice to be back with you guys and to be able to share this morning and to spend some time in worship, singing and praising together. I used to intern here many moons ago when Pastor Kumar was around, and my first summer here was part of our practicum program in school, and I was blessed enough to be placed here and mentor under Pastor Kumar, and in fact I loved it so much that I came back a second year without pay as well. So you guys have an amazing community here, and I'm just glad to be a part of the history somewhere down the line. But today we're going to be looking at Psalms chapter 137 and Psalms chapter 138. And I wanted to take a look at these two Psalms and kind of read through them together with you. And I felt that the Psalms together especially were very apropos. They're very appropriate to our times and to what we're going through. And so I wanted to read those with you today. And to start off, we're going to be starting with Psalm chapter 137, verses 1 through 6. And this psalm, if you're unfamiliar with the Psalms are a collection of poetry, of both songs of worship, of praise, and of lament. And so the Psalms can really be divided into a couple of different categories. They can be psalms or songs or poems of praise, worshiping God, and they can also be poems of lament, where they are lamenting and grieving, expressing the pain that they're going through at the moment. And the Psalms are about 150-something different psalms, and they're all written by various different authors. Not all of them were written by King David or by King Solomon, but they're written by various different authors throughout different periods of time. And so Psalm 137 is one of those psalms that we don't know who wrote it. We're not quite sure the author of Psalm 137. They are an unknown author, but it presumably takes place based on the context and the content of the psalm. It takes place sometime in the Babylonian captivity. So at some point in time, the Israelites, they were captured by Babylon. They were taken away as slaves, exiled into a foreign land. And so presumably 137 here takes place during that captivity, perhaps before the time of the prophet Daniel, definitely before the time of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, where some exiles were brought back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city walls. So this takes place sometime before all of that, after the captivity. So we're going to read together Psalm 137, verses 1 through 6. I'm reading from the New International Version if you guys want to follow along there. It says this: "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept." So this tells us it's a psalm of lament, grieving. "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept when we remembered Zion, when we remembered Jerusalem. There on the poplars we hung our harps. From there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us the songs of Zion. Sing us the songs of Jerusalem. Sing us the songs of the temple.'" Verse 4. "How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy." So based on what we read here, it appears that the psalmist is some sort of musician. He's a musician that likely plays the harp, and he writes about hanging up his harp. He writes about being asked to sing. And it's likely that this musician was actually probably a worshiper of the temple in Jerusalem. He was likely a Levite that had to do something with music, much like we had here with the worship band. He had something to do with music, and so he would have been one of the temple singers likely. And so these people, these captors, these tormentors, he calls them, the Babylonians, are asking the psalmist, the Levites, the priests, to sing these songs of joy. Sing us these songs of Israel, of Zion, of joy. Sing us these songs of celebration, they're asking. And it's kind of a strange request, because you can imagine how difficult these people the time that these people must have been going through, how sad and how heartbroken they must have been at knowing that not only were they captives in a foreign land, but knowing that their temple was destroyed, knowing that their city lays in ruins, knowing that everything that they have loved about their nation is completely gone and obliterated. And now they're in a foreign land, and they're foreigners, these captors, these tormentors, he calls them, are saying, "Dance for us, sing for us, entertain us. Sing the songs of joy." And the psalmist asks this question: He says, and I'm sure most of you have felt this way as well. He asks, how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in captivity? How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? Now it's interesting because if you read the whole psalm, there is no response. There's no relief. There's no salvation that comes in Psalms 137. It actually ends pretty down. It ends pretty depressingly. It ends pretty sad. It just ends with this, how can we sing while we're in a foreign land? How can we sing while we're oppressed and depressed and far from our home? How can we sing when things aren't going so well? But one thing to keep in mind as we read the Psalms is that even though it's comprised or composed of 150 different songs, the Psalms are not meant to be read individually. Sure, we can take a chapter and read the chapter by itself. We can even take verses that we love and pick them out and read them by themselves and take these beautiful wisdoms, these beautiful revelations of God's truth from the Psalms. But the Psalms are not just meant to be read by themselves. In fact, the Psalm is meant to be read together, collectively. I'm not sure if you know this, but the Psalms are actually divided into 5 different books. There are divisions within the Psalms themselves. And so it's interesting that whoever compiled the Psalms compiled all of these poems and songs with intention, with purpose. And so we can read them again as standalone chapters, but we also need to see the Psalms as a collective. So let's practice this. Let's read the next chapter, Psalm 138, verses 1 to 5. It says, I will praise you, Lord, with all of my heart. Before the gods, I will sing your praise. I will bow down toward your holy temple, and I will praise your name for your unfailing love and for your faithfulness. For you have so exalted your solemn decree that it surpasses your fame. When I called, you answered me. You greatly emboldened me. May all the kings of the earth praise you, Lord, and when they hear what you have decreed, may they sing of the ways of the Lord, for the glory of the Lord is great. So Psalm 138 is actually a Psalm of David. We know that. It was written by David, and David writes this, with all of my heart before the gods, I will sing your praise. I will praise your name for your unfailing love and faithfulness. And so David's reason for singing is God's unfailing love. David's reason for singing is God's faithfulness. David is responding to God, and he's saying, listen, I've cried out for help, and you have answered. You have come. You have rescued me. David's reason for singing is because of the great love that God has towards him. So here's our very first lesson for today. Our first lesson is this. We sing because of his love. You see, what's interesting here is that Psalms 138 was again written by David, so it would have been written a couple of centuries before Psalms 137. And so the Psalms aren't in chronological order because that's not the purpose. The Psalms are meant to be read together, and so Psalms 138 comes right after 137, and it almost seems as if the compiler of the Psalms has put Psalms 138 as a response to Psalms 137, because again, 137 doesn't end with hope. It doesn't end with response. It doesn't end with salvation as we might expect. Many of David's laments end with him praising God for the rescue that he experiences, but Psalms 137 doesn't. So Psalms 137 asks this question, how can we sing while in a foreign land? How can we sing while things aren't going our way? How can we sing while we're oppressed? How can we sing while we're feeling defeated and downcast and desperate for salvation? How can we sing for joy? And then David responds in Psalms 138, centuries before. He says, we sing because we know that God is faithful. Come on, somebody. We sing because we know that God is faithful. We sing because we know that God's love is unfailing. We sing because we know that he looks on us with care. We sing because Christ, because Jesus, because the Messiah is our hope. So this question is asked, how can we sing? And the response is, well, we sing because of his love. We sing because of the way that God is. We sing because of who God is. God is by very nature love. See, there's a difference between praise and thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is thanking God for what he has done. It's a response to what God is doing. But praise, on the other hand, is independent of what God is doing. Praise is praise and worship and honor because God is worthy of it. It's not the same. We often confuse thanksgiving and praise, and we often think that praise is thanksgiving, and they can be intertwined, but there is a very important distinction that has to be made. Praise is not about what God has done in your life. Praise is because God is who He is. Praise is because God is who He says He is. Praise is because God is unfailing in His love. Praise is because God is faithful. Not just because He's been faithful to you, not just because He's shown unfailing love, but because that is the very definition of who God is. That is His character. So we can praise and we can sing independent of what we're going through because God is love. We sing because of His love. And I know that it's very difficult sometimes to lift up praise, to sing, to feel thankful. Especially when we look around and when we see in the news that things just keep getting darker and darker and worse and worse. When we see that just when we thought things were kind of beginning to blow over, that resurgences are coming, that different waves are coming. Just when we think that things are getting better, we see new bodies being found in residential schools time and time again. We're up in the thousands now. Just when we thought things were getting better, we're now seeing BC, I don't know if you guys know this, but BC has the worst fire that is currently happening in its entire history. Over 50,000 hectares, over 300 kilometers squared. That's a huge area. Just when things seem to be getting better, it seems like it just keeps getting darker and darker and worse and worse. And it can be really difficult to lift up praise. And I know that it's frustrating to see the systems that are in place that continue to oppress and marginalize people. And I'm infuriated when we're seeing hate crimes occurring all over the city, all over our country. I'm infuriated when we're seeing our systems of government have not even begin to set right the inequalities that we have seen in the communities around us. And I'm frustrated when we're seeing discrimination left, right, and center, not just racially, but sexually and gender and everything. Literally any kind of discrimination, any discrimination that does not line up, and in fact it doesn't, discrimination cannot line up with the character of God. So it's frustrating to see when all of this is happening. And we see that Psalms 137 encounters a very similar problem. They're like, how can we sing when things aren't going well? How can we sing when the world seems dark? How can we sing when we have lost our hope? And what's beautiful about the Psalms is that the Psalms don't ignore human suffering. See, Christianity in this relationship with God isn't simply about finding the joy. There is a reality that there is pain. And what I love is that in the Bible, there's an entire book dedicated to that suffering. The Book of Lamentations gives dignity to the suffering that we experience. It says it's real. It happened to you. You're allowed to feel the way that you feel. But what I love is that David's response is this: regardless of what we're going through, we can sing because God remains faithful. We can sing because God's love continues to be unfailing. You see, God's unfailing love happens even in the hardship, even in the anguish, even in the lament that we experience. And the hope that we cling to is that one day God will put an end to all the suffering. The hope that we cling to is that one day God will put an end to everything that is wrong in this world, that God will set things right. And so even when the world tries to steal our joy, even when the world has us longing for something better, we can choose to praise because we know that God always is faithful. Because we know that God always keeps His promises. You see, we sing because Jesus is coming. We sing because hope is coming. We sing because God is always faithful and there is something better to come. And so the question that is asked is, how can we sing? And the response is, well, we sing because He is loving. We sing because He is love. So I want to read with you the rest of Psalm 138. Psalms 138 verses 4 to 8 says this: May all the kings of the earth praise you, Lord. When they hear what you have decreed, may they sing of the ways of the Lord, for the glory of the Lord is great. Though the Lord is exalted, He looks kindly on the lowly. Though He is lofty and far away, He sees them from afar. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you preserve my life. You stretch out your hand against the anger of my foes. With your right hand you save me. The Lord will vindicate me. Your love endures forever. Do not abandon the work of your hands. Now, David's acknowledging how great God is, and even though God is highly exalted, even though God is in the heavens above, God still notices us. He sees us. He sees our pain. He sees our suffering. He sees what we're going through, and He comes down, and He steps into the mess, and He steps into the mud, and He saves us. And then David ends with this request, do not abandon the work of your hands. And now we're going to jump ahead again, Psalms 139, the very next chapter. Verses 13 to 14 says this, for you created me, another psalm of David, for you created my innermost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. And then he says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. See, what I love is that the wording that David uses here implies that God created all of us, not just him, but all of humanity with intention, with purpose, that every single one of us, God looks at us and says, you are wonderful. You are loved. You have been created with intention and purpose. And in the very previous chapter, Psalms 138, David says, don't abandon the work of your hands. In the next chapter, he says, the work of your hands are beautiful. The work of your hands is loved and cared for and created with intention and purpose. And so here's our very second lesson. Our second lesson is this: God won't abandon you. David says, please don't abandon the work of your hands. And then he responds in the next chapter, the work of your hands are wonderful. And you've created them. And God will not abandon you. And you see, we have reason to praise in our darkest times because we know that God has plans for us. See, God promises that He won't abandon the work of His hands. God didn't create you beautifully and wonderfully just to abandon you. God created you to prosper. God created you to give you plans of a hope and a future and to restore you to the kingdom of peace that He is bringing to this world. And so whatever you're going through, whatever you're struggling with, whatever seems to be closing in around you, whatever is looming over your life, know this: God has not abandoned you. Know that God is still with you. And God hasn't caused your troubles. I want you to know that, because a lot of the times we blame God for what's going on in our lives, and God hasn't caused your troubles. God hasn't caused your storms. God is not behind the oppression that you experience at the hands of evil people around you, but God is your way through the troubles. God is the one who calms the storms. God is the one working through good people around us to bring an end to the oppressive systems of the world. See, God looks on you and He sees you. He sees your suffering. He sees that you're in the midst of your troubles, and He stretches out His hand to cover you. And David, again, in Psalm 16, he praises God for the confidence that even though he should die, that even if he loses his life, he still believes that God will not have abandoned him. Psalms 116, David says, you will not abandon your loved one to the grave. Even if this life ends for us, we know that we're not abandoned to the grave. That's the beauty of the gospel. The gospel says that Jesus conquered the grave. So even if we should go there, even if we go into the grave, the very same way that Jesus resurrected from the grave, we also have the promise of resurrection. That's what Paul says. I love what Paul says in Romans 8. He says we live in the same resurrection as Jesus. He says the same Spirit that resurrected Jesus is living in us now, to resurrect us now, to bring us back to life now. That even though we should die, that even though we should lose our lives to whatever the world throws at us, Paul and David says, still we're not abandoned. Because Jesus went into that grave and He defeated it. So now there's hope in Jesus. Jesus has conquered the grave. And I know that deliverance comes in so many different ways. Deliverance can come in miraculous intervention. I'm sure you've heard many stories. But deliverance may come in the simple fact that the gospel promises that death isn't the end. Deliverance comes in God's people refusing to silently watch, refusing to be frozen by fear, and choosing to actively step up and create positive change to create a world free of the systematic oppression of marginalized people all over the world. Deliverance comes in God's people standing up for the rights and the lives of people all over the world. Deliverance comes in God's people standing up against racial and gender inequalities. Deliverance comes in God's people actively bringing God's kingdom of justice and peace and love and mercy to this earth here and now. See, the work that we do in the world around us to bring peace and justice is part of the way that God shows the world that he hasn't abandoned them. Did you hear that? You are the proof. You working in the world for good. You working in the world for love. You working in the world for justice and mercy. You are the proof that God has not abandoned this world. Come on, guys, get excited about that. You are evidence of God's love. You are evidence that God is working right now. You are the evidence. You see, God's kingdom is here. God's kingdom is now. And God's kingdom is wherever people are fighting for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And you see, the people of Israel, they know about suffering. They know what it's like to be marginalized and enslaved and oppressed and defeated. They know what it's like to have generation after generation die in captivity and never see deliverance in their lifetime. They know what it's like to be handed from one nation to the other. And still we find in the Psalms inspire us with hope. Still we find that the Israelites are like, praise God for what he has done. Praise God for his faithfulness. The Psalms continue to call God's people to praise God for never abandoning us. Can you imagine that? Generations that die in captivity still claim and hold on to the hope and the faith that God hadn't abandoned them. So the writers of the Bible, they know this one thing. They know that God never breaks his promises. And so if God has promised to set things right, he's going to do it. If God has promised to return for us, he's coming back. If God has promised to put a final end to sin in the world and create an eternal kingdom of heaven here on earth, if he's promised that, he will do it. And so even though for Israel there were some people who never saw freedom and deliverance, they knew that God would keep his promises, and so they praised because they knew that God would never abandon them. See, what I love about the Psalms is not just their individual expression, but also the way the Psalms are compiled. You see, just like any good musician, there is intention, not only to the arrangement of the notes in a song, but also to the arrangement of the songs in an album. Some of the very best albums, they function together. The songs function not just as individual tracks, but they function as a story. As you listen to the entire album, it tells you a story, and it inspires you. And so the same thing happens here in the Psalms. Not only is every chapter in the Psalm a gem of inspiration, something to be read and pondered on and praised, but so too the way that the Psalms are organized and arranged are reason to praise. We saw that just with Psalms 137, 138, and 139. And what I love here is that the compiler of the Psalms, he put these two Psalms together to fit in conjunction. Again, Psalms 137, he poses that question that never seems to get answered. How can we sing? It doesn't get answered, but Psalms 138 answers it. We sing because of his love. What I love is that Psalms 137 seemingly ends with no hope. It questions the injustice they experience. It clamors out for help. It seems as if God's people have had their songs of joy stripped away from them. But then as we continue reading the Psalms, as we continue listening to the tracks, we come to chapter 138. We come to David finding reason to sing and to praise because God is loving, because God is faithful, because God won't abandon the work of his hands. And so Psalms 137 finds no reason to praise, but Psalms 138, David shouts and he says, I can't stop praising. I can't help but sing. And just a chapter away, David is saying, I've found my reason to sing. So here's our final lesson for today. Our final lesson is this. Hope is a chapter away. Let that sink in for a moment. Hope is a chapter away. If the Psalms, which span centuries and generations, captivity and freedom, highs and lows, if the Psalms teach us anything, it's that hope is coming. See, so many of the Psalms are songs and poems that point to the future coming of a Messiah. They point to the coming of a king who would liberate Israel and establish a kingdom of peace here on earth for God's people. They point to a time where all nations, it says, will come together and bow down before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, before the mighty name of Yahweh. And you see, all of these hopes and all of these expectations, all of these promises are fulfilled, and they're found in the person of Jesus. Jesus is the King who liberates us from captivity. captivity from sin, captivity from death. Jesus is the one, the King who liberates all nations from slavery and death. Jesus is the King who brings peace and justice and forgiveness through the cross. Jesus is the Prince of Peace, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Jesus is the one worthy of all praise. And I came across this quote that I really loved, that I found that was so incredibly beautiful. The quote says this: "Even the darkest hour only has 60 minutes." Even the darkest hour only has 60 minutes. See, the night may be dark, but joy comes in the morning. Your world may be dark, but as surely as the sun rises in the morning, so too will your hope rise through Jesus. And things may seem hopeless now, but hope is just around the corner. Hope is just a page turn away. You may currently be in a chapter of lament. You may currently be in a chapter where you're singing, "How can I sing? How can I sing these songs of joy? How can I praise? How can I lift up?" You might be in that chapter now, but just flip the page. Hope is just a chapter away. And the world may try to steal your song. It may try to steal your reason for praise, but despite the sin that we see in the world around us, we can still praise, and we sing because we sing of His love. We sing because of His love, and our song is found in God's faithfulness. Our song is found in God's righteousness. Our song is found in God's unfailing love. You see, God's love remains persistent through the ages. God's love remains constant through the storm. Sin creates the troubles and the difficulties that we find, the injustices in the world, but God's love is bringing peace to the storms. God's love is bringing freedom to the captives. God's love is working through people to set things right in the world. And so while the world seems dark, we sing because God's light is still shining through. We sing because of His love. We sing because we know that God never breaks His promises. We sing because God won't abandon us. Even through our difficulties, God is still here. Our cries for mercy don't fall on deaf ears. God hears us from on high, and He stretches out His hand to save us. And even if salvation doesn't come in this lifetime, He still hasn't abandoned us. Even if we lose our lives in this lifetime, we're still not abandoned to the grave. And if we pass away into that sleep, we know that death is not the end. That's the beauty, that's the hope of the resurrection in Jesus. Our hope is that just like Jesus rose from the dead, so too will we rise again when He comes. And what I love is that even when we're in that chapter of lament, hope is just a chapter away. God has promised that He's coming back. Jesus has promised that He's coming to prepare a place for us so that where He is, we might also be. See, our hope lies in Jesus. Our hope lies in the cross. Our hope lies in the resurrection. Our hope lies in the kingdom to come. And so the current chapter in your life might be a chapter of lament, but just a chapter away is your chapter of praise. Just a chapter away is your chapter of hope. Just a chapter away is your reason to sing. Jesus is coming to set all things right, and we don't have to be afraid because hope is coming. So regardless of what chapter you find yourself in now, you can lift up praise and believe that hope is just a chapter away. Amen.